Hello, today I want to ask the question, where is colour? So in a way this is a different way of asking what is colour. But I think it's more precise because in order to understand what colour is, we need to first decide whether it's a physical property of the world or a property of our brains or indeed something else. I'm actually still in my hotel room in Thailand, by the way, as I record this. I'm here attending the AIC Colour Conference. So of all the questions I'm going to discuss in this series, perhaps this one is the most complicated, and probably I was ill-advised to choose this as my first question. I will probably lose all of my subscribers with this video. Now, at the end of the day, colour is complicated, and there is no simple answer to the question, where is colour? But I hope today I'll present some of the arguments in a logical and digestible way. Let me know in the comments whether I achieve this or not. I will tell you what I think, but I don't think there are clear right or wrong answers to the question, where is colour? There are different arguments or positions, and each has its strengths and weaknesses. But to do this topic justice, this may be quite a long video, and because of that, I'm going to split the video for this question into two parts. So in part one, I'm going to talk about some important concepts such as primary, secondary qualities. So let's start with the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. This idea is mainly associated with John Locke, an English philosopher who lived in the 1600s, but also Descartes also talked about this idea. So primary qualities are properties of an object that are independent of any observer. Examples of primary qualities are shape, size, and how many objects there are. They are objective facts. Secondary qualities are properties that produce sensations in an observer. Examples are taste, smell, sound, and colour. Secondary qualities are subjective and cannot exist without an observer. So one of my favourite quotes of all time is by Democritus, who several thousand years ago said, "By convention there are sweet and bitter, hot and cold. By convention there is colour. But in truth there are atoms and the void." And in a similar vein, much later, Galileo said, "I think that tastes, odours, colours, and so on are no more than mere names so as far as the object in which we locate them are concerned, in that they reside only in the consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all of these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated." So you may have heard the question, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there, does it make a sound? And I was once asked this question, by the way, in court as an expert witness in connection with colour. So some of these things may sound very esoteric, but often have really important practical consequences. So if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there, does it make a sound? I'm certain that both Democritus and Galileo would have agreed with me that it would not. And what this means is that if the universe had no living creature, or at least no sentient beings, then there would be no colour, no sound, no smell. But it wouldn't mean that colour doesn't exist. To say colour doesn't exist just because it's something we experience rather than a property of the world is like saying love and pain don't exist. They very much do. So when the tree falls, it generates movements in the air. Movement of air is a primary quality. The air hits your eardrum and activates so-called hair cells in your ear. So these hair cells are the auditory equivalent of cones in the eye. But instead of responding to light, they respond to movement. And these cells generate signals that in turn activate other parts of the brain, and we experience sound. The sound is a secondary quality. So when it comes to colour, Newton wrote that objects are not intrinsically coloured. Rather, they appear coloured only because they reflect this or that ray of light. Today we might say wavelength of light rather than ray, but the concept of wavelength was not known to Newton, of course. But light is also not intrinsically coloured. Different wavelengths of light merely have the property to induce in us this or that sensation of colour. So if you believe the primary-secondary dichotomy, then it's obvious that colour is a secondary quality. But it seems to me that it's still a secondary quality of light or of objects, not a quality of the brain. So light or objects have the secondary quality to be able to induce in us this or that sensation of colour. This would still therefore allow people to argue that colour is a property of the world, albeit a secondary one, and that property enables us to experience colour. So it seems to me that the primary-secondary quality debate doesn't conclusively settle the argument about where is colour. So there are two main problems with our current understanding of colour, which some people refer to as the Newtonian understanding of colour. So the first one I'm going to call the ontology problem. This is that it remains unclear whether colour should be regarded as a secondary property of light or objects, but nevertheless a property of those objects, or whether it should be considered to be an experience and therefore a property of the brain. Sometimes people use the word qualia to describe these private experiences that we have, which constitute our consciousness or our conscious experience. And some people say this is a distinction between objectivism and subjectivism. So objectivists take the view that colour is a property of the world, even if it's a secondary one. And subjectivists take the view that colour is something that we experience and is strictly only perceptual. The second problem I'm going to call the hard problem of colour. The philosopher David Chalmers introduced the idea of the easy and hard problems of consciousness. We might discover that when certain neurons in the brain are excited, we experience this or that conscious experience. That is the easy problem. We've solved that pretty much. But we don't know how brain activity causes consciousness, or even why. That is the hard problem. Similarly, we can have the hard problem of colour. We know that colour vision occurs when brain cells in the visual cortex, part of the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, are activated. But we don't know how this happens or why. Why do we have phenomenological experiences at all, for example? Why does short wavelength look blue and long wavelength look red, and not the other way around? We simply do not know. In fact, nobody knows this. Furthermore, we have no idea, as far as I can tell, about even where to start. And until we find answers to these two problems, which I'm calling the ontological problem and the hard problem of colour. We don't have a full understanding, and therefore there will always be some room for disagreement about where colour is or what it is. And of course, there are people who've challenged the very idea of primary and secondary qualities, most notably David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And I'm smiling slightly inside because I first heard the names of Hume and Kant as a young boy when I heard a Monty Python song, and I literally can't help but smile every time I hear their names. So much so that I've put a link to the song in the description. But getting back to the point, both Hume and Kant challenged whether it's really true that primary qualities are objective facts and secondary qualities are subjective. And part of their argument was that even so-called primary qualities are subjective. So maybe the distinction is not so helpful after all. Now, I'm not a philosopher, but feel free to dig deeper into this topic if that's your thing. I can really recommend the book Colour Vision by Thompson if you want to read more. So he is a philosopher, and philosophers write in a very particular way, using words incredibly precisely, whereas I tend to use words quite loosely. So that I often find myself reading each sentence in his book over and over again to make sure I understand it. But nevertheless, in the case of his book, it's worth it. I also want to note that objectivism and subjectivism are not the only two games in town. The last 50 years or so has seen the emergence of a third view called relativism. According to this idea, colour is neither the property of objects in the world nor of our brains, but rather a property of how the two things relate to each other. Personally, I don't buy it. I think it's a fudge. But I couldn't complete this video without mentioning it, otherwise I would have people complaining. So what do you think? Do you accept that we have primary and secondary qualities? And if so, do you think this means that colour is a property of the world, of objects or light, or a property of the observer? So I did tell you I would say what I think. I'm a subjectivist. I think colour does not exist in the real world. I agree with Democritus and I agree with Galileo. And I think that if colour exists anywhere, it exists in the brain. And if we eliminated all living sentient creatures in the universe, there would be no colour. But hopefully in my presentation today, hopefully I've at least left the door open for people who want to take a slightly different view. So in part 2 of this video, I want to move away from these strictly philosophical arguments a little and explore slightly more practical issues such as wavelength, reflectance and cone responses, to try to shed some clarity on this question of where is colour. So for now, I hope you didn't find this video too dry and that you'll come back for the next one. If you do nothing else, then at least listen to the Monty Python song in the description.